In the throne room of Norgzel, Queen Nasakarasa presided over the tedious mechanics of her kingdom, and her great awakening had imbued her with divine purpose. But the engine of progress was a grinding, inefficient thing, and her immortal patience, once calm like the sea, was now chafed against the slow trickle of reports that would come in from the peasants in frustratingly small increments. Every choice she had made in her path of growth would yield only a pittance of gold, when other plans could prove more fruitful. But the error was not a source of change, as the queen did not indulge in such useless emotions. The flaws that existed in her lands, she would one day shatter and remake in her own image, and for now she must endure. And the peasantry would bring boons, and their lives would be improved by the order that she was imposing. And they would come and make offerings, and she would accept them, commanding the resources be invested into the development. And these fuel would burn slowly as the things grow to satisfy her ambitions, but later her attention would turn to her experiment in dynastic growth hatchling. Now a tough soldier, he had come of age. The broken, disfigured child she had plucked from obscurity was now forged into a decent weapon. His spirit hardened by childhood fear and strife. He was unrefined, but he was a success. And it was time to put him to use, and to build a dynasty that would carry her essence through the ages. She needed mages, and she would use her fruit bearer, a woman whose lineage was known for her latent magical talents, would make her broodmare and arrange the marriage. And this would, of course, reduce the standing of hatchling, but the benefit of breeding arcana into the realm would be of benefits, and the feelings of the two individuals were irrelevant. See to it, the union will be finalized by the new moon, and we will hold a hunt and search for more prospects to consummate the marriage. And the wedding ceremony was a stark profare, a brief ritual, but of course the ceremony was not enough. And in a display of power and a need to apply prestige to increase hatchling standing, the queen would declare a celebration of a hunt, a rite of blood and claw, and they would go and hunt down for the bat in the swamps. And the swamps, of course, were fueled with many dangers. And as they ventured further, they found themselves encountering the Spriggans, and the foliage would turn against them. And these, of course, would not be simple beasts, and it would be the wrath of the land itself. And in a life or death battle, it was a whirlwind of chaos and violence. The men screamed as they were impaled on sharp branch-like claws and cloaked by the grasping vines, but through it all, Queen Nasa was a pillar of cold fury. She did not see this as a threat, and she reveled in the violence, her powers lashing out, raising the bodies of the fallen to fight alongside her soldiers. And in that desperate battle, her unyielding will would allow her to live, and the forest would be forced to break. And as her party tended to their wounds amidst the remains of the Spriggans, they would eventually stumble and hunt for the bat further. Mind the cliffs! Do not worry about the bats or the plants. We will hunt them down. And as they were continuing on their hunt, they would eventually require an encounter. A nestled ancient altar of bone and fur, a shrine to the Daedric Prince Hircine, and to Queen Nasa. She would not condone the acts of other Daedra in her lands. Vermina was enough for her. And of course, it was shunned by the Hist itself. So she would need to rebuild her relationship with the ghosts of the land again and purge any other danger entities within the area. And her soldiers would be awed by her conviction and would smash the altar and remove the holy grounds. And Nasa would commit to acts of piety to rebalance herself and reconnect with the Hist, that she, in her heart of hearts, would remain loyal to it despite her connection to Vermina. And invigorated by this act, she would resume the hunt. And of course, unfortunately, with her husband Branche, she was not able to obtain the bat. And it was too elusive, but the hunt was a success. Other lesser bats were slain, providing plenty of bounty for the feast. And there was a sighting of a legendary beast. Who knows how this could go and unfold in the future. It was white as snow, and it didn't seem to have the same fur or wings, but it was a clear sign that her piety at the shrine was rewarded not with a kill, but with more glory that she truly needed. And she will return to her throne room triumphant. And with her prestige replenished, it was then that the true reward was revealed. And a messenger would bring forth a shift in ancient laws. And while she was away, the options previously denied to her were now available. Where did this come from? From the beginning, this path was never opened. She had now possessed a legitimate casus belli to declare war, and could now unleash her armies on her enemies in the name of the Hist. And despite the regular conquerings, she lacked the necessary piety, for she was a sinner that made a pact with Vermina. And Nasa only did not despair in the face of this, but she saw the beautiful divine logic of it all. And now that the path was clear, she could refocus her objectives and move on to a better place. Her sins and her transgressions had given her the tools she needed, and her righteous faith will light the path that she needs. And all that was left was to pay the toll. And the conquest of the marshlands was no longer a distant dream, and it was only about time itself. And for the queen, she possessed that in abundance. The Queen of Norgzel was a creature of two minds. In public, she was an awakened revolutionary and the engine of progress for her people. And in the quiet solitude of her throne room, she was a snake in a period of unnerving stillness. And her path to war was clear, but the toll booth required piety, and she was forced to wait, allowing her spiritual wounds of her sins to scar over. But an intellect like Nasa never truly sleeps, and she would dedicate this period of forced inaction to study her craft and pore over the military histories of the continent. And she would settle into an insightful text, the lessons of the Blackwater War. And this text detailed the Reman Empire's disastrous campaign in the Black Marsh, and this war would be analyzed through the philosophies of its three commanding generals. The first, General Bucko, a fool. He clung to tradition, marching his heavily armored legions into the swamps, where they were swallowed by the whole terrain. Nasa dismissed him with a sneer of contempt. Tradition was a cage, not a shield. The second, General Sardincus, was a brute. He achieved his goals by settling the entire country on fire. a wasteful and unsophisticated tactic. But the third general, he was a creature after her own heart, General Falco, a true pragmatist who had abandoned conventional tactics. He had allied himself with pirates and sailors, using their speed, knowledge of hidden routes, and moral flexibility to achieve victory where honor-bound armies had failed. And Nasa would crick a smile as she read about General Falco. And in his methods, she saw a reflection of her own philosophy. Why build a grand army when one could simply leverage the avarice of raiders? Why adhere to the rules of war when a victory could be purchased from those who had none? And the lesson was clear, that true power would not lay in brute force, but in cold, logical application. And it would be a lesson she wouldn't forget. But before she would close the book, she would look back at General Sardincus again. Because even though the pirates have their way of raiding, there will come times where you need to burn everything and build it back up from the ground. And this would be especially beneficial in the marshlands where there is nothing but huts and no castles. And in this time of waiting, through quiet meditation and rituals of her priest, absorbing the hissed incense, her piety would be renewed, and she would be able to declare her ambition. And her gaze would pass over the nearby territories, yet it would cut through the silence of the room. In the name of the Hist, and for the purification of this land, we will declare war upon the heretics of Ike, and we will give the child ruler a lesson in the consequences of leaving one's nest unguarded. Nasa, whose gaze would pass over the territories, she would look at a city and see nothing but merchants and would pass that land for now, but the domain of Ike was ruled by a baby Hist chieftain, and the quarry's armies was raiding off to the north, leaving their home utterly defenseless. And she would teach them a lesson as the helpless victims that they were. And the war for Ike was not a contest, but a dissection. And Nasa's horde would descend upon the territory, finding its villages and its keep manned by a little more than a crew of town guards and peasants. And when she would send the offer for surrender, it was not immediately accepted. The queen would take great joy in employing her sadistic wrath upon the land itself. And she would provide and play with them like sport, for they would reject their chance for a clean break. And she would take a cruel pleasure in their suffering, and she would strike at their weakest points with chilling precision. She would cut off their fresh water. She would have her necromancers raise the corpses of their dead to claw at their walls in the night. And each day she would send a new, more horrifying offer of surrender that would detail the fates that would await them if they continued to wait, employing all manners of torment, as much as the physical destruction that she would havoc. And this would be the price for defying her, for making her wait even a moment longer. She was not conquering people, but vivisecting, decimating societies, for she would burn it all to the ground and build it up again piece by piece, all while their armies were away. It was a masterclass of cruelty, and in this midst of slaughter, an interruption would occur. A lone traveler would be brought before the queen, and this man would have been patiently waiting for weeks outside the lines for an audience, and he was a Horwali, a man whose skin was weathered by the sun and salt, and he would bow deeply before the queen before presenting his offer. Your Highness, my name is Lord Cooley. I have traveled far and wide, from the deserts of elsewhere, from the shores of the north, and I am weary of the road. If you will allow me to stay, I will share my knowledge of the world with you and be your loyal servant. And she would study the man with an intense gaze and note of his build and his eyes. He is not afraid of the necromantic queen. And she would welcome the newcomer in her heart of hearts as a boon, whose knowledge of the wider marshlands and beyond would be an invaluable asset for her development. But she did not just look at the gains itself. She saw a man of experience and pride, and a spirit who was whole to be devoted. And she would take this well-traveled man and make her toy, another project to be bent to her will. And she would make him an entertaining prospect. Your knowledge may be of use, but your loyalty must be absolute, and your old ways will mean nothing here. And you will embrace the Hist, and you will serve my faith and my throne. Do this, and Norgzel will be your home. Refuse, and you will be nourishment for the roots of this swamp. The choice is yours. And Lord Kashuli would accept, of course, high-hearted. He would now be a piece on the Queen's board, and in his arrival, it felt like a sign of the Hist providing her with the tools that she needs. Exactly when she needed them. And the siege would eventually conclude, and the gates of Ike would be breached, and the baby Hist would be dragged before her in chains. And in her first conquest, she would obtain the land and prove in the efficacy of her methods. And in this first step, she would gain a holy site and look forward at Bog Wraith as her next target. The slaughter was a satisfying taste, but the work had only just begun. Victory itself is a potent intoxicant, but for Queen Nasa, the conquest of Ike was an appetizer, and she would immediately begin the work of consolidation. And her mind would analyze the deficiencies of her recent battles, and she would expand and retrain her archer corps, ensuring that she would have the perfect counter for the troop comps of future enemies. And minor court affairs were handled with swift, dismissive efficiency, and eventually a warrior would be recommended to her command by the name of Tannen, and she would grant him the honor and add another capable piece to her board, and her engine of ambition was primed and running hot. But even as she planned, her nights would be plagued by a strange recurring vision, and it would be in the remnants of her hunt, an echo that had become warped and obsessive, and she would no longer dream of giant bats, and instead her slumber would be haunted by an elusive beast, and a creature of impossible whiteness that would shift in form. And some nights it would be like a great bat with wings like the fresh fallen snow, and on others it would be a phantom snow fox with eyes of chipped ice, an unknowingly beautiful thing that always remained out of reach. And it would be a prize her soul craved with a maddening intensity. And the vision did not bring her frustration, but it stoked the fires of her resolve. And it would be the symbol of the unattainable, but she would desire to attain it, all of it. But before she could chase phantoms, there were tangible manners of her crusade, and her gaze would fall upon her next target, and it would be a prize far greater than the lands of Ike. And it will be the sacred holy site of Bog Wraith, and her enemy there was weak entangled in other conflicts and drowning in debt. It would not be a regular war, but a cleansing, and her armies would march, and the campaign would be beautifully short, and she would take Bog Wraith easily. And with the holy site secure, the queen would begin her true rite of conquest. She would commune with the Hist there, pressing her hands to its living bark and opening her mind to the consciousness within. What she experienced was not simple visions, but a deluge. In centuries of memories, the collective lives of thousands of Argonians, the thoughts, the deep thoughts of the trees would flood to her being. And it would be like a psychoactive go-go juice, a torrent, a spiritual torrent, and a connection to her people. And from the communion as she would lay in the sacred moss, the queen would still be there, but be enveloped in the divine. With the confidence of a true zealot, she was high and drunk on the power of her God, and the Hist would show her the righteousness of her cause, and she would be its chosen instrument. And all caution would be burned away by its ecstasy, and she would not look at anyone as merely enemies, but blasphemers and obstacles to a destiny that was manifest. And in this sublime state, she would return to her war room, her eyes faint from the green luminescence. The conquest of Bog Wraith was merely a stepping stone, and she would soon test her own mettle, and she would pursue the territories of Raka Pit, Raka Park, and invite war with many different chieftains, with forces that outnumbered her own. And to them, they would see this as a suicide attempt, but to her, it was an opportunity to prove the power of her conviction. They have numbers, yes, but I have the blessing of the Ghost Hist. The dead are on my side, and it will be enough. And as enemy armies would move against her, a lesser ruler would be consumed by fear, but she would be buoyed by her fervor and would remain calm, and her victories prior would give her time to execute her grand plan. And as the enemies marched, her thoughts would turn into matters of deeper, more practical importance. And she would be studying everyone's traditions and would develop an obsession with the recordings of history. And she was not in it for romantic or philosophical pursuits, but it was the ultimate form for her immortality. As a lich, she had conquered death, but her memories would be housed in only her mind. If she were ever forced to transfer her consciousness over, the knowledge could be lost or corrupted, and the revolutionary techniques that she had for developing her domain could not be trusted to memory alone. It was a codex of great power that she possessed. She would not allow it to fall into just out of disarray. And so, in the encroachments of this ongoing war, the queen would have her journal, but it would not be a diary. It would be a manual, a backup of her own mind. And she would not write of coming battles with dread, but with the language of a field biologist observing a specimen. And she would document troop composition, supply lines, and her meticulous plans for the development of her island. And this would be the true nature of her genius, for it would be the perfect fusion of a fanatic and arch pragmatist, and her soul would soar on the ecstasy of the war, and the Hist would flood her mind with great designs for her end, and her mind would document the mundane math of its own execution, for she was outnumbered and her capital threatened, and her entire future would wrestle on a gamble fueled by the Hist itself, but as she wrote, preserving her knowledge for the ages, she had no doubt that the Hist had shown her the path, and her intellect would pave the way, and the story of her own victory was already being written, for it was consumed and enabled by Sithis.